what is going on, guys? So today we're going to be installing the manual transmission into the car. So there are a couple things to note before we actually start lifting this thing in that we need to address to make sure that this thing goes on properly. Tools we will be using: a 3/8 driver, E10 socket, E12 socket, and E14 socket. So back again with the transmission, those bolts are E-Torx sockets. You do need to use Torx sockets for them. I'm not going to bore you guys with that spiel again. I think I got it clear the first couple of times. So just know that we'll be using those. A 10mm, there is a bolt on the back of the transmission that we removed and to keep that heat shielding on there. A 13mm, so the crossmember bolts for the transmission are 13. The transmission mounts, I believe, are that size as well. The slave cylinder nuts are 13, so we will be using that guy a little bit to sort of secure everything down. And some extensions. Now the manual transmission is a lot shorter than the automatic, so we don't need two massively big ones. I did use a combination of all three of those guys to get the transmission on. In addition to that, most of the bolts I did not have to use an extension for at all, so keep that in mind. And a jack. So the jack is going to help us get the transmission on a little bit easier, so we're not fighting the weight to get it up into its position. We just sort of guided it on while the transmission was on the jack, so it helped out a lot. In addition to that, it's going to be a lot easier if you have two people, so I have Arthur help me out today. So we're going to get this thing done. So for one, I have my clutch fork, throwout bearing, all that good stuff already lubricated, so we don't have to worry about that. I do go over that in the manual swap assembly video outside of the car. I'll put a link in the description for you guys for that, so you can get all of this stuff all nice and lubed up before we throw it in. The second thing is I have put new transmission fluid in here. I'll leave a link in the description to that video as well to make sure that we get some new trans fluid in here before we throw it in. It's going to make it a lot easier outside of the car than it is to put new trans fluid when the transmission is in. Aside with that, as for getting the transmission on, because the clutch is basically smashed in between the pressure plate and the flywheel, we're going to have to get these splines lined up on the clutch disc for it to line up properly. Otherwise the transmission is not going to go on all the way. As we're lifting the transmission up, we're going to try and get this guy in on the clutch, but while we're pushing it forward, I'm also going to be spinning the output shaft of the transmission, and that's going to spin that input shaft right there. So as I'm pushing the transmission on, I'm going to be wiggling this guy to get that clutch lined up, and then it should go on all the way. And so if you don't do that, these splines might not get lined up, and it's more than likely not going to sit flush on the engine, and it's just going to be a real big mess trying to get this thing on. In addition to that, when we get a couple of the transmission bell housing bolts on, before we tighten all of it down, we do have to get this guy lined up, and this is the starter. So this little dowel pin is going to sit right in this little hole on the starter and sort of hold them in place like that. So when we have a couple of the transmission bell housing bolts on, I'm going to reach up and pull the starter on and onto the dowel pin, and from there then we can get our starter bolts in to hold that guy into place. It might be a little bit of a trick because there's not going to be a lot of room, but we do have to get that guy on properly, otherwise basically the car is not going to start. And once those are all on, we're going to tighten all of the transmission bell housing bolts down. The transmission will be on. Of course, we're going to have the transmission still on the jack. From there, we're going to put our slave cylinder on, and we're going to try and get this guy in as straight as we possibly can to ensure that it gets on the clutch fork inside properly. In addition to that, while the transmission is still tilted down a little bit, we're going to go ahead and put the shifter on. This guy is going to slide over this black part. Now, because I have a DSSR rod, there's going to be a pin that goes through a washer and then a clip, but if you have a traditional rod, it has a little end on it, an OEM rod. That rod is going to slide through here, and then we're going to put a clip on the end of that. So that'll hold that guy into place. This guy is going to slide up in here. We have this little retaining clip. That's going to go through there, and then we're going to push this guy straight on down. And once that clip is down there, that is going to hold that shifter into place. So a couple things to do like this before we get the transmission all the way up and the crossmember bolted down. Just some things to remember that we are going to need to install this stuff right before we put that on. So I would recommend putting the shifter on at least once before you try and put it on, so you know what you have to do when you're up inside the car and you're not figuring it out for the first time. Okay, so now from here we're going to drag the transmission underneath the car. I got it. This thing's actually light, no worries. Okay, so I have the transmission right here. In addition to that, we are going to be putting a jack on a block of wood underneath the front part of the oil pan and jacking up the front of the engine. That is going to take this whole engine and tilt it down a little bit for us, so we're not going to have to go in at such a straight angle to get this transmission on. We can kind of go in at a little bit of an angled approach, so that'll make it a little bit easier to get this transmission on, and hopefully we can get it on pretty quickly. Okay, so here's the front of the oil pan. I'm going to take a nice block of wood and we're going to put it like that, and then we're going to jack it up right here, and it's going to tilt the whole engine up. So we got a decent amount of tilt. The engine is sitting a little bit upwards, so that's going to help us a little bit to get this thing in there. I have pulled the shift linkage off of its carrier bushing to make some more room here, so we have some more room to work. I have also tied the slave cylinder off to the lower control arm, so that's not going to be in our way at all. And we're going to want to make sure that our O2 sensor wires up top are actually up top and out of the way. They like to hang out right in front of the transmission here, and so if you pinch those guys when you get the transmission on, you're going to have a bad time. In addition to that, this little metal thing is going to be kind of a pain to keep in place. I'm not sure if this is because mine is a little bit bent. Just know if you're struggling with that, I'm going to be struggling with that too. Okay, so now we're about to start our attack on getting this transmission in. I am going to be putting another jack on the bottom of the transmission to help us get it up in the air. From there, we're just going to maneuver it basically on, spin the back of the input shaft to get it lined up, and then hopefully it should just clip into place, and then we can start throwing the transmission bolts on. I have all of my tools and all of my bolts right here, so when we get this on, I'm not scrambling to find all of the tools and bolts that I need to hold it on. So I have it off to the side here, so it's sort of out of the way, but I have everything here. I have my really long extension here, so when I do actually go to put all of the stuff on, I know where it is and it's all ready to go. So this is just a little bit of preparation I'm doing. And I even have the 13 mil for the cross member. So all of that good stuff, we're just getting all prepared for that. So this thing should hopefully go in smoothly. Ready? Forward, can we get? Alright, sort of spin that output shaft. Can you spin it?
Nope.
Keep pushing it forward.
Okay. Oh, I think we're on.
That is in, boys. Alright, put the jack up. Did you feel it go in?
Yeah.
Fuck yeah. Alright, leave it right there. We'll get a couple of these bolts on. Look at that. Okay. Alright, so we now have all of the transmission bolts on. Aside from the starter bolts, we haven't put the starter on. But I just wanted to go over the technique with you guys a little bit. So once we get that input shaft sort of aligned and slipped in with the clutch, we're kind of going to want to push it forward as best as we can. Then from here, we're going to go after the main bolts. So there are 4 E14 bolts that go on. There's one on the bottom right here, one sort of on the middle up here, and then the 2 on the top. So we're going to go after those guys, and you want to push the transmission on with those 4 evenly. So don't stick that one in, crank it all the way down, and then stick that one and crank it all the way to the side. You're going to jack the transmission in and jack it back. You sort of want to evenly push the transmission on by going after all 4 of those bolts. And then once those guys are all on tight, then we're going to go in and do all of our E10. So there's a couple running up on this side. Get those all nice and tight. Get them nice and snug. Don't really crank on them like you would the main bolts. Those main bolts are really on there tight. We really put some muscle behind them. But these little E10s, just get them nice and snug. Don't murder them, otherwise you might snap them. And so now we're going to go after the starter up at the top. Alright, so that's snug. Now I'm going to get it tight. Okay, this other starter bolt tight. There we go. Alright, the transmission and starter is now on. Alright, so this is where our slave cylinder is going to go. So I'm going to pull these guys off, the little nuts that hold it onto place. And we are going to take him and slide him into his hole. If you watch the video on assembling the manual swap outside of the car, you know I emphasized putting this guy on perfectly straight. So I'm going to try and do that and get this guy on nice and straight so that our clutch fork will go on properly. And he is pushing back on me, so I'm pretty sure it's safe to assume that he's on where he needs to be. And I got the clip on the lower one as well. Alright, there we go. So now we are going to be installing the shifter linkage. We're going to want to make sure that our bend is backwards, going towards the rear of the car when we install this. So I'm going to put the shifter through the hole, and I'm going to get this guy on the carrier bushing, and then that guy is going to go in. Very nice. And then I'm going to get the upper rod on the transmission, and we got his clip is going to go in there, on and down. There we go, that's in. And now we have to connect our shifter rod to that. So for the DSSR rod, I do have to lube up my little pin. Get that pin all nice and lubed. Through that guy. And then our clip is going to go on. There we go. And now the shifter is on. So I'm going through the edit right now, and I forgot to mention one thing. So when you have the slave cylinder and the transmission on and still tilted down before you put the crossmember on is going to be the easiest time to bleed the clutch lines and all that good stuff. So in the description I will leave a link to the bleed video for bleeding the whole clutch line system. It's going to be easiest when the transmission is tilted down like it is, because you're going to have better access to the slave and the bleed screw on it. So while it is down like that, I did the whole bleed procedure. If you watch the bleeding video, you'll notice that the transmission is still tilted down. It's going to give us a little bit better access to the slave cylinder and make it easier to bleed it. So one thing to note, before you put the crossmember on, you can bleed it when the crossmember is already on and the transmission is already up. Before you put the crossmember on, bleed your slave. Alright, so the last thing we have to do to this is to put the crossmember on it. So I have my crossmember here. Now I have the mounts on it already. I have extra hardware for it. You can reuse the hardware off of the automatic transmission. So just as a quick rundown, these guys have a little dowel pin on it, and the engine mount has a cutout on the back for that. So we're going to line those guys up. We're going to put our nut and washer combo on that guy. We're going to get them on there, but we're not going to get them tight yet. So the transmission mounts also have a dowel pin on them. So one here and then one right there. So we're going to loosen these nuts up top up, and we're going to take our crossmember bolts out on both sides. And the manual transmission does use different crossmember holes. So these two were the automatic, and this one are going to be for the manual. And so basically we're going to slide this over these little holes in the transmission, just like that, and we're going to tighten these guys down. Get those guys snug but not tight. Now I have Arthur back here, and he's going to lift the jack up, and these holes should get fairly close to lining up, like right about there. And so then I'm going to thread these guys in. One here. We got one right here, and we got one right here. Now I'm going to run these guys all the way up. I'm going to get them snug, now tight. Alright, once we get all four snug, then we're going to tighten them down. We're going to get these bottom ones tight. And then we're going to let the jack down. And once the transmission has settled into its little spot, we're going to tighten the upper ones down. And then after that, we have this little 10mm that sits in that guy right there, so we're just going to thread him in and run him on. There we go. Alright, there we go. Our transmission is on. Thank you guys so much for watching. Keep it fresh, and I will see you guys later.